Good morning, everybody. Let's go ahead and get to our Section 3 notes for the Great Depression. So, this will be our last section of notes for this chapter. A couple other things on the horizon just to be looking out for. A vocab quiz coming up. I will give you guys a study guide posted to your classroom after all of our notes, and we'll have a test on this chapter as well. So, just be ready for all that. Today, I guess I should have escaped there. As you guys are watching, listening, reading over the slides, I have posted your Section 3 notes as a Google Doc, so you can go ahead and be filling those in as you guys are listening or as you're watching. Again, all your notes and things will be what you need for your study guide and your test. Your activity today that's going to go along with your notes is going to be a short, brief reading on Hoovervilles and shanty towns and what unemployment was like during the Great Depression. It's going to look like this. So, not too much there, a little bit of a blurb, just some stuff I'd like you guys to read over. And there's a couple questions afterward down here. Again, if you follow along with the reading, it goes in order. It's nothing too overwhelming. We would usually just do this together in class and draw on the Promethean, but it's something that you definitely can do on your own and answer those questions, okay? Great. Let's go ahead and get started. Hope everybody's having a good day. Hope everybody's having a good week. All right, don't forget to be filling in your opening questions. So we only have a few more weeks of those. So again, get as many of them done as you can. If you guys ever miss or forget or can't find stuff, it is all still posted in your Google Classroom. So if you miss a day of opening questions, if you miss an assignment or whatever, please go back and look at your Google Classroom, okay? For your opening question today, this caused the stock market to continue to climb because people, quote, believed that stocks and companies were more valuable than they actually were. And that word is speculation. Or I guess that thing is speculation. We're going to see that term thrown around a lot. You've probably watched it between Crash Course or Story of Us. They've talked about how speculation in the market is what kept driving people to think, just like the 1920s. Well, every time we have a company, it becomes more and more and more and more valuable. And sometimes that was the case, but there were other times where companies weren't producing as much stuff. They weren't making as much money. They were laying off workers rather than hiring workers. So their companies weren't as valuable as they were, and those stock prices weren't actually that high. So speculation. Just following up a little bit, connecting speculation to one of our things we watched the other day on our America, the Story of Us Bust episode. By the time America realized that people were being let go from work and we were overproducing, the margins, quote unquote, or the speculation of prices were out of control. Everyone had just assumed and bought stocks on credit and put themselves in debt and been told by everybody, well, it's okay, the stock market will continue to go up and rise and you'll make your money back, putting people more and more at risk of losing everything. Once people caught on to what was going on and kind of started figuring out, this led to a massive amount of people rushing to banks to pull their deposits and income out of the banks. If you guys didn't see this the other day, I would encourage you to go back and watch your episode of Story of Us with Bust. They mentioned a little story at the beginning about one man who kind of starts to figure out, well, if the bank is taking all the money and investing it in the stock market, and so are people, and so are all these companies, like that's very worrisome. There's not going to be as much money in the banks. He goes down to his local bank, the United States Bank of America, and he essentially tells the teller, "Hey, I want all my money." Like, you know, how you do at the bank because it's your money and that's how the banks work. Now, again, in the 1920s, 1930s, banks weren't required to keep a certain amount of money, actual tangible cash in the banks. So when this man says, I want to withdraw all of my money, the bank doesn't want to do that with him because hypothetically, if everybody did that, the bank wouldn't have any money left. And that's exactly when he leaves that bank, he starts spreading this rumor and telling people, well, the bank didn't have my money. The bank doesn't have my money. The bank doesn't have enough money for me. And I don't know about you guys. If one of you came to me after you went to the bank this morning and said, hey, Mr. Chris, I went down to our local bank and asked for my money, and they said they don't have it, that would cause me to panic. I would be stressed out. I would go down to the bank and try to get as much of my money out as I could as possible. And you see what this leads to is what we call bank runs. So now whether the banks actually have that money or not, when 10, 20, 50, 100, 1,000 people show up and pull out all of their money, all their savings out of the banks, that really, really, really hurts the banks. So again, bank runs is when we see that people all at once show up there and pull out and take away their savings, their short-term savings, their whatever it may be out of the banks. All right, today's schedule, we're going to do our opening question, which we did. We're going to go over our Section 3 notes. Your Hooverville and Shantytown activity will be posted. Vocab quiz will be sometime next week. We'll talk more about that depending on which class you guys are, whether that'll be Tuesday or whether that'll be Thursday. So keep an eye out for that. If you're not sure, please email me and we'll clear that up with you guys. Your Pinheads and Patriots are due not this Friday, but next Friday, which is May 1st. All right, let's go ahead and jump right in today. I'll read over our questions, we'll put our answers in, and have a little kind of mini discussion, talk about stuff. So A, on March 7th, 1930, President Herbert Hoover told the press that, quote, the worst effects of the crash upon unemployment will have passed during the next 60 days. Again, Herbert Hoover's whole philosophy is laissez-faire, hands-off, the economy will fix itself. And again, to kind of play a little bit of defense for my man Herbie Hoover here, no one had ever experienced this before. We haven't had a president or a government that had, an economy boom so quickly with things bought on stocks, with things bought on credit, where things actually not bought with actual tangible money. So a lot of people really believed this will just correct itself. It will kind of figure itself out. Letter B, Hoover was worried about the Depression. To devise strategies for improving the economy, he organized a series or conference bringing together the heads of banks, railroads, and other big businesses. So what he essentially did was go out and find the leaders of these huge corporate businesses, your Rockefellers, your Carnegies, your Fords, your JP Morgans, whatever it may be, brought them all together and kind of talked over a strategy of, well, what do we do? What businesses do we help? What businesses can be salvaged? If we help, the oil industry or the car industry, will that help industries below it? And I want you to think about, like, from the standpoint of today, not comparing the two things directly, but even in the last 4, 5, 6 weeks, you've probably seen or heard or watched stuff with the president right now, Donald Trump, meeting with other heads of corporations, whether it's Amazon, Google, whether it's sports commissioners of all the sports leagues to try to stimulate the economy. And they're kind of doing similar things to, like, how do we, if we can help certain businesses in certain areas and certain groups, hopefully then those parts of the economy won't fail and we can maintain people with paychecks and jobs and so on and so forth. So I think that's interesting how we have that real world connection right now. Letter C, by 1931, Hoover increased the funding for public works projects, or just public works, or government finance building projects. So we've talked a little bit about these in class. Again, they've definitely come up when you guys watch The Story of Us. You got to see 2 of those public works projects in action. We're thinking about things like the Hoover Dam. We're thinking about things like Mount Rushmore. You're thinking about things like the Brooklyn Bridge, like the Golden Gate Bridge. And again, pardon me, these things take a lot of, think about why they would be useful during the Great Depression. They take a ton of raw materials that America already has access to. Things like steel, things like concrete, things like whatever it may be. In order to build them, it also takes a lot of time, labor, and workers to do so. So that gives, if you weren't building those things, people aren't working. But by building them, you're creating jobs for people to help build things. And then finally, on the after effects, like the Hoover Dam after that, is something that then creates and generates power and helps stimulate local economies in places like Las Vegas and Phoenix and Los Angeles and neighboring cities around it. Or things like Mount Rushmore in South Dakota is now a tourist attraction because, no offense to South Dakotians, I hope no one has family from South Dakota. If you didn't have Mount Rushmore and that giant statue of Crazy Horse in South Dakota, you probably wouldn't go to South Dakota. That's the most I've said South Dakota in the last 5 years, so I'm proud of myself. Letter D. From the start, Hoover strongly opposed the federal government's participation in relief, which was money given directly to impoverished families. Now, again, you guys are all allowed to have your thoughts and opinions and beliefs here. Basically, Hoover's line of thinking was, if we as the government are just going to give people money and hand money to people, this will decentivize them to want to go find a job, to want to go find self-worth, to want to go make a difference and do something. So at the very, very beginning stages of the Great Depression, when we didn't quite know what it was, that was a very real, tangible thing for Hoover. I don't want to just give people money. I want people to be motivated to go find work and be a part of society. As the Depression got worse and worse and worse, and the mass amounts of unemployment, and we had people starving and people that were homeless and a lot of horrible things happening, this became a much bigger issue. And a lot of people within the government and people within the United States really pushed for, we need some type of relief to help people, because this is no longer just a small little recession. It is the greatest depression in American history. Again, real life, real world correlation. You could already see this would be an example of how things have been treated differently today. As the U.S. is kind of going through this recession right this moment and what's going on because of the pandemic, you guys have probably seen, read, watched, or whatever, the idea of these things called stimulus checks, where the government is giving money to certain pockets of people based on their income. Again, in order to try to help them, it's quite literally to help them make ends meet and survive during this time. But it's also a way to stimulate the economy. Maybe they'll take their money and do something and improve their house that they're living in. Maybe they'll spend it on who knows, whether it could be just groceries or whether it could be any kind of goods that are going to be brought and delivered to their home. Again, the idea that it will keep people in work and move the economy that way. And again, just some of our public works projects we talked about. You guys have seen Mount Rushmore before in South Dakota. Again, that other statue, if you Google it, you can go to the Google machine. I believe it's Crazy Horse is also being built not too far away from Mount Rushmore in South Dakota. It's monstrous. They've been working on it for the better part of like 30 years. And it's supposed to end up being bigger than, it's like supposed to be 10 Mount Rushmores is going to be the size of that Crazy Horse statue. Crazy Horse was a Native American from like the 17. Okay. Hoover Dam down here, as you can see again in Nevada, however you want to say it. It's a dam, obviously, that's going to create hydroelectric power for other parts of Nevada, Los Angeles, Arizona, and the Golden Gate Bridge, which goes across in San Francisco and California. Also, where Planet of the Apes almost took over the world, because that's a real thing that actually almost happened. I'm joking. It's a movie. They're apes. Okay. On to our last parts. So Herbert Hoover, before I guess I get on to Herbert Hoover, he really does become one of the least popular presidents in American history. If you had to, I'm sure if you put on the Google machine and we're like worst presidents ever, other than William Henry Harrison, who doesn't wear a coat during his inauguration speech, gets pneumonia and dies 30 days later. Real smart stuff there. Outside of him, you would probably find Herbert Hoover in most of your lists because of what goes on during his presidency. His lack of action, his lack of help and call to action to do something really makes him unpopular, as things also, again, between the Dust Bowl, between the stock market crash, between the Great Depression, the end of World War I, Hoover is not exactly the guy that you thought he was going to be. Also, not to mention your fun trivia fact about Herbert Hoover, he is, or I should say, before he became the president, he had never held a position of elected office in his life. He was never a congressman. He was never a governor, a mayor, a city councilor, anything. So that's where a lot of people attacked him based on his lack of experience in politics, is that he had never gone through something like this before. And then he ended up in charge of one of the hardest times in American history. All right, so in an angry mood, I wonder what this slide's going to be about. In January 1931, about 500 residents of Oklahoma City looted a grocery store. Crowds began showing up at rallies and starting these things called hunger marches. Now, I point to this one incident not because it was the worst or the craziest or the most out of control, but because it was the first. And during the 30s, when now we have radios and newspapers and we're all connected around the world, this one small little event, which isn't small, by the way, I mean, 500 people looting a grocery store, that's a lot, but it gains national attention. And it starts to spark in people the idea of, yeah, okay. Like, if he's not going to do anything, if the president's not going to help us, if the economy is going to continue to tumble, maybe we have to do something like that. Maybe we have to turn to like fend for ourselves and take care of our families, our children, so on and so forth. And this idea eventually sprinkles down into other kind of like mini riots, looting of stores, things like that. But mostly the thing that comes out of it is those hunger marches and people trying to gain national attention to show what's going on in their parts or their pockets of America. Letter B, after World War I, prices sank so low that farmers began losing money. We know we talked about this already. Creditors foreclosed on nearly 1 million farms between 1930 and 1934, taking ownership of the land and evicting those families. Evicting meaning kicking them out. If you can't make your mortgage payments, if you can't pay rent, if you can't pay for your tractors or your land or your feed or your seeds or your resources, someone has to pay for that. And if you can't make any payments on it, and if you go so many days or so many payments without a payment, then eventually the only way the government can collect the money you owe them is by taking those things back. And you're seeing people go into bankruptcy. To continue kind of rehashing this point, the idea this is already bad. People aren't producing and making enough stuff in the first place. And now after these farms and these whatever they may be are being taken away or closed, now it goes from not a lot being produced to zero being produced. When there's less of stuff being made, it becomes less of a rare thing. And then because it's not scarce and it's not so whatever, those prices continue to sink. So this would be the actual scene down here from the looting and rioting in Oklahoma City. I know this almost seems like it's staged right here, but these are people that were actually killed within the looting and the rioting. And you can see that it's going to create a lot of tension between these police officers that are being told to protect and serve and help and stand up against these stores and these whatever it may be brick and mortar places being attacked. But at the same point, they're watching people who are starving, who can't feed their children. And it becomes kind of this weird moral conundrum for people as like police officers and authority figures. Letter C. After World War I, Congress had enacted a $1,000 bonus for each veteran to be distributed in 1945. All this means, and again, pardon me, think about it this way. Remember when we talked about war bonds and things like that, where people were giving money to the government to use during World War I to help us win, and then eventually they were going to be made whole, paid back their war bonds, and then plus some interest. This was kind of looked at the time as a very similar thing to a bond, but it was just simply a bonus for the men, the brave, I guess it would have to be men at that point because we're talking World War I, who returned after fighting in the trenches and risking everything because, from America's standpoint in the 1920s, they had become a superpower of the world. We were one of the strongest, most powerful nations in the world. We thanked our soldiers and our men that not only helped win the war, but kind of helped set us up to be in part of that position. So they put together and passed this legislation that's going to grant those guys $1,000 each. And again, when you're talking about inflation, that's closer to somewhere between like $10,000 and $20,000 today in today's money. Still a nice little chunk of change to help them buy a car, buy their first house, take care of their families, whatever. But it won't get to them until 1945, by the time they're done paying everybody out. So in 1931, Congressman Wright Patman introduced a bill that would give veterans payments of these bonuses. The press termed the veterans marching toward Washington as the bonus army. So this guy Wright Patman basically sees the writing on the wall of what's happening during the Great Depression and takes it upon himself to be like, well, this isn't good. Obviously, what's all happening right now, what's going on. He viewed this as another way to stimulate the economy. Well, rather than wait to give those guys their $1,000 bonuses now, we should go make them whole and pay them right now. because then these guys will go out and buy, like we just mentioned a second ago, they'll buy a Model T, they'll buy a new car, they'll buy a house, they'll buy, and again, stimulate the economy by putting that money back into the hands of the citizens. Any of these people, these veterans of World War One, again, uh, just like any times you're talking about like Memorial Day, Labor Day, parades, and things like that, they come to Washington D.C. to basically receive their payments, and they're called the bonus army because they're getting their bonus checks, and they're in the military, and that's a punny term that people get to say. Letter E. Once in Washington, I should say the bonus army. Pardon me. Once in Washington, the bonus army swelled to, pardon me, 15,000. So you have roughly 15,000 former soldiers in D.C. However, the Senate voted down the bill, and veterans outside began to, I love the phrase, began to grumble. People were upset. People had come there, promised, hey, you're going to be given your dues, what you were supposed to get, a kind of thank you for your service in World War One, and now it's not happening. Hoover ordered the buildings to be cleared, and police fired into a crowd, killing two of the veterans. This becomes a very out of control situation very quickly. It ends up, again, think about the way they're trying to spin this to the media. Hey, look at this thing that we're doing. It's a really great thing. We're celebrating our veterans of World War One. We're helping stimulate the economy. We're trying to make this a great PR thing. And then kind of unexpectedly, the Senate votes against it. They don't want to give that money to those soldiers. They think they can wait. They'd rather spend that money somewhere else. And the tension between, again, the local authorities outside DC and the actual bonus army kind of boil over, and we see this kind of mini little riot fight between those two sides. Many of these soldiers had been unemployed since their return from World War One and were very dependent on these bonus army checks. Rather than wait for their bonuses to come in 1945, many demanded them ASAP or didn't believe their money would ever show up. Again, that was a real thing of fear. A lot of these guys were seeing what was happening during the Great Depression and thought, if we don't get this now, if we don't cash these checks now and get what's deserved to us, based on what's going on during the Great Depression, we may never see this money. And just again, I think the visuals always help me. This is your bonus army right here outside the Capitol building in DC. And this is part of the fight in the aftermath of when the bill gets voted down and they realize they're not going to get that money. I tell that story, and I think it's an important story because as we kind of put our final wrapping paper and bow around Herbert Hoover and his presidency, again, we see this man who's never been elected before become the president. We see a time where during a stock market crash, during a natural phenomenon like the Dust Bowl and this insane drought that happens for the better part of a decade, the end of World War One, through the Great Depression, he just can't catch a break. Everything he tries to do, something goes the other way. If he tries to do something, it doesn't really work in his favor. Most of the time he says to do nothing, it somehow makes things worse. The last ditch effort here to kind of get some positive publicity is like, well, hey, we'll take care of these World War I soldiers who did such a great thing. And it turns into a violent riot and protest where we actually have two of those guys getting killed. So Herbert Hoover, as you can kind of see and get the vibe of, doesn't really go down as one of the most popular presidents in American history. Another reason for that is going to be his predecessor, the guy who takes over after him, someone known as Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And we're going to see some of his successes and failures, a lot of the good stuff that he ends up doing through the 1930s and 1940s. All right, so again, make sure as you guys are following along, we're done with our slides, filling in your notes. That's going to be attached to your doc as well. And then I ask you guys, this shouldn't take you longer than 15, 20 minutes maximum. Take your time, look over the map. Again, if you click on stuff, you can stretch it and make it bigger to zoom in on things. I know it's not ideal. It's not perfect to see. But just read over those little stories and little things I'd like you to talk about with Hoovervilles and shanty towns, and then answer those questions for me. Make sure you click turn in when you guys are done with it, okay? I can't think of anything else right this second. Like I said, I'll have your study guide and your test at some point next week. We'll do a little bit of GimKit at some point here to review vocab so we can get some practice in there for your vocab quiz. And your current events are going to be due pretty soon here, Friday, May 1st. Other than that, I hope everybody has a great day. I hope you guys are having, trying to stay safe, stay healthy, stay happy, do something to stimulate that brain a little bit. If you guys need something from me or have questions, please feel free to reach out and let me know. Otherwise, I will talk to you guys later. Have a great rest of your day.